Now, there may be those who question the historicity of Jesus Christ. And in answer to that, I would really say the best thing to do is to read for yourself the first 4 books of the New Testament, the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke and John. Because there you have a full account of the life that Jesus lived. And for example, if we were to turn just to Luke's Gospel and the opening verses, we would read these words: "Inasmuch as many have taken in hand to set in order a narrative of those things which have been fulfilled among us, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word delivered them to us, it seemed good to me also, having had perfect understanding of all things from the very first, to write to you an orderly account, most excellent Theophilus, that you may know the certainty of those things in which you were instructed." And what we have to recognise is that the life that Jesus lived was lived out before hundreds and thousands of people who saw with their eyes the things that Jesus did, who heard the things that he said. And if any of these things have been exaggerated or blown out of proportion, then we would expect any one of his enemies to have drawn this to our attention. But search as you will for any writings written in that period, you will not find anyone who contradicts the writings of Matthew, Mark, Luke and John. And that is one of the reasons why we can be so confident that Jesus Christ really did live the life that you read of in these 4 books. Now, what does all this prove? Well, the miracles that Jesus did in making the blind to see, the deaf to hear, the lame to walk and raising people up from the dead, surely those miracles prove that Jesus Christ really is the Son of God. And then there is his life, because as we examine that life, we recognise that here is a person who lived a spotless life. On one occasion, for example, he stood up publicly and asked who could convince him of sin, who could point out anything that was wrong in his life. And then Judas Iscariot, one of his followers, said, after he betrayed Jesus Christ, that he had betrayed an innocent man. And at his trial, Pilate said, "I cannot find fault with this man." 4 times he said that. So these things all point to the fact that Jesus Christ is more than just a great prophet. He's more than just a religious leader. He must be the person that he claimed to be himself, none other than of God himself. Now, then we have to take into account the prophecies in the Bible. When we take into consideration the Old Testament was written and completed some 400 years before Jesus Christ was born, we shall find that in the Old Testament these prophets told us where Jesus Christ would be born and the circumstances surrounding his birth. They told us the life that he would live, and in quite some detail how he would die and rise again from the dead. Now, there's over 300 prophecies in the Old Testament, and all of these were fulfilled. And surely these prophecies too point to the fact that Jesus Christ must be the person that he claimed to be, none other than the Son of God himself. And then we might just look at the resurrection, because on that first Easter Sunday morning, when Jesus revealed himself to his disciples, they couldn't believe that he had risen from the dead. In fact, they really thought that he was a spirit or a ghost. And Jesus had to say to them, "Come on, touch me, handle me, for a spirit or a ghost doesn't have flesh and bones as you see that I have." And then he sat down and had a meal with them. Now, when the disciples told Thomas, who wasn't there at the time, Thomas couldn't believe it, and he said, "Look, unless I can put my finger in the nail print in his hand, unless I can put that fist in that gaping wound in his side, I will not believe." And some days later, Jesus appeared to his disciples again, and this time Thomas was there. And Jesus said to him, "Come on, Thomas, put that finger in the nail print in my hand, put that fist in that gaping wound in my side." And Thomas didn't need any more persuading. He just dropped to the ground and said, "My Lord and my God." And Jesus appeared to his disciples again and again over a period of 40 days. And after 40 days, he took his disciples up onto a mountain overlooking Jerusalem, and he ascended up into heaven. And so the account of the resurrection, again, proves that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. But maybe I ought to perhaps just pause here for a moment, because I'm aware that there may be those who may have questions with regard to the evidence for the resurrection, and there may be those who might say, well, maybe the disciples stole the body from the tomb and then declared that he'd risen from the dead. But then when you look at that, you've got to ask yourself the question, would people really be prepared to lay down their lives for something they knew wasn't true? Now, there are plenty of examples in history of where people have been prepared to lay down their lives for something they truly believe in. But if these disciples had taken the body from that tomb and were fully aware that he was dead, would they have been prepared to lay down their lives, as almost all of them did, for proclaiming that he'd risen from the dead? I don't really think that that stands up to examination. And then, of course, there are those who would perhaps say, well, maybe the Romans, anticipating that the disciples would attempt to take the body, switched the body to another place. Well, again, if that was so, when the disciples were proclaiming that Jesus Christ had risen from the dead, why didn't the Romans put the body on display and show that he was dead? They never did, and so one assumes that they hadn't got the body. And then, of course, there would be those who would perhaps say, well, maybe Jesus Christ didn't really die upon that cross. Maybe he just faked death, and he was then put into the tomb. Well, if that was so, we have to take into consideration that Jesus Christ was in that tomb for 3 days and 3 nights without food and water. He had lost a lot of blood, and can we really expect that in that condition he could have moved a stone that took 2 men to put there and tattled the Roman guards and then proclaimed that he'd risen from the dead? Again, I don't really think that that stands up to examination. And in fact, every explanation that has been put forward down through the years has never stood up to examination. And in fact, it was Lord Chief Justice Darling who said that the resurrection of Jesus Christ is one of the most well attested facts of all time.